He boarded the plane quietly, just another elderly black man in a wrinkled suit. No entourage, no headlines, just seat 3A and a worn leather bag. But when a flight attendant told him to move to economy without apology, no one knew they were witnessing the beginning of something unforgettable. They didn't see the weight of medals tucked behind his silence, the decades of service stitched into his spine. They saw only age, only color. What happened next didn't just shake the cabin, it shook the conscience of a nation. This is not just the story of a veteran denied a seat. It's the story of justice finding its voice at 36,000 feet, of a nation remembering the heroes it never truly saw, and of one man who carried the sky long before the sky ever carried him. Stay until the end, because this isn't about one flight. It's about all the times we've looked away and finally choose not to. He sat alone in seat 3A, his back straight despite the quiet fatigue etched across his dark skin and aging frame. The cabin lights cast a soft glow over his silver-streaked hair, cropped neatly like the military demanded, even decades after his last mission. His suit wasn't new, but it was dignified, pressed with care, the seams worn thin from years of good use. His tie was a little off-center, but his posture, his presence, still carried the weight of a man who had once been saluted by soldiers. He folded his hands in his lap, fingers trembling slightly from age or memory or both, and looked out the small oval window as passengers trickled into the plane, shuffling toward their seats in a symphony of rolling suitcases and murmured conversations. A flight attendant, blonde, efficient, and visibly stressed, made her way down the aisle with practiced urgency. Her eyes swept past row 2, then snapped back as she caught sight of him. A brief flicker of something, discomfort, annoyance, calculation, passed over her face. She paused, straightened her uniform, and approached. "I'm sorry, sir," she began, her voice sharp around the edges, more procedure than apology, "but you'll need to move to economy." The man blinked, slow and confused, as though her words had traveled a long way to reach him. He shifted slightly in his seat, unfurling a printed boarding pass from the pocket of his blazer. It shook gently in his hand as he held it up. "But this is my seat," he said, his voice quiet, deliberate. "Seat 3A. It's printed right here." The attendant didn't even glance at the pass. "There's been a reassignment," she said. "We're overbooked. Someone else purchased full fare." Her tone never softened, not even when she saw his hands, weathered and calloused from decades of service, nor when she glimpsed the small lapel pin on his collar, the faint outline of a distinguished flying cross, nearly rubbed clean by time. "I'm going to need you to come with me now, sir." Around him, passengers shifted in their seats, suddenly interested in overhead bins or seatbelt buckles. A few glanced up, then quickly away. No one spoke, no one intervened. Not yet. He sat there for a breath, then 2, as if waiting for someone to say this was a mistake, but the silence in the cabin was thick. He slowly unbuckled his belt, gathered his worn leather satchel, patched and faded, adorned with old tags from places most people only saw in war documentaries, and stood. He was tall, though age had taken some of his height. Still, he held himself with quiet pride, like a man who once knew what it meant to stand on a tarmac, with engines roaring and eyes scanning the horizon. As he turned to make his way down the aisle, someone in a nearby row muttered, "Guess you gotta pay to stay, huh?" A soft chuckle followed. He didn't look back. He just walked, steady but slow, the way soldiers march when their bodies remember pain, but their hearts remember duty. 5 rows back, a teenage boy stared, wide-eyed. "Mom," he whispered, tugging her sleeve. "Isn't that him? From the ceremony? The guy on TV last week?" His mother looked up, eyes narrowing as recognition bloomed, her lips parted, but no words came. Her gaze followed the old man, this stranger who wasn't a stranger at all. 2 seats over, a businessman lowered his newspaper, brow furrowed. Further down, a middle-aged Army veteran straightened in his seat, posture suddenly stiff, the way it does when old instincts stir. Something was wrong here, something shameful. But still, the man continued down the aisle alone, each step echoing not just against the floor, but against the quiet complicity of 100 eyes pretending not to see. The flight attendant didn't even wait to see where he sat. She turned and disappeared back toward the front of the cabin, as if the matter had been settled, as if nothing remarkable had happened. But something had happened. Something deeply, invisibly wrong. And the sky, patient and all-seeing, was not done writing this chapter. Not yet. He made it only halfway to economy when the whispers began to spread, quiet as a rising wind. "That's him," someone murmured near row 7, just loud enough for a few others to hear. "That's Elijah Brooks." A passenger in a charcoal suit froze mid-sip from his plastic cup of water, his eyes narrowing as he turned slowly to look. A woman scrolling through her phone let it fall to her lap. Her gaze followed the old man's steps. Small, deliberate, weighed down by more than age. The name meant something. It echoed. Elijah Brooks, the man who flew into war zones with no backup. The man whose hands pulled orphans from landslides, whose chopper once hovered over floodwaters for 11 straight hours to rescue a school of children before the levee broke. His face had been in the news just 3 weeks ago, honored by the Department of Defense. A ceremony broadcast live, a speech given not by Elijah, but by the generals who called him the heart in the sky. And yet, here he was, being stripped of dignity by a system that didn't pause to ask a name. As Elijah neared the back of the cabin, a former Marine named Dale, sitting in seat 21D, stood up slightly in his seat, watching, his jaw clenched. "That man carried 3 wounded medics through sniper fire in '76, he whispered to his seatmate, almost like a confession. "And now he's being shoved to coach like some college kid on standby." Elijah kept walking. Not a protest, not a glance back. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. That's when the cockpit door opened. A silver line of light sliced across the aisle as it swung wide. A man stepped out. Uniform crisp, buttons gleaming, wings on his chest. Captain Marcus Bell, mid-30s, mixed race, eyes sharp, jaw tight. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. He scanned the rows with the precision of someone trained to see not just the obvious, but the overlooked. And he saw it. The figure of an old black man in a wrinkled suit, stepping carefully past carry-ons and laptop bags. His boarding pass crumpled in his hand like a discarded memory. Captain Bell's voice rang through the silence, not loud, but clear enough to slice through every mutter, every diverted glance. "Excuse me, can someone tell me why Colonel Elijah Brooks is not in his assigned seat?" The plane froze. A second passed, then 3. The flight attendant reappeared from the galley like a ghost, her face pale, eyes darting. "Captain," she said quickly, nervously, "there was an issue. The flight was overbooked and someone—" He held up a hand. "Just one." It stopped her cold. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His tone carried the full authority of a man who knew exactly what it meant to watch someone walk into death for strangers and return with no thanks. He walked straight to Elijah, whose eyes had widened in disbelief. "Sir," Captain Bell said, stopping directly in front of him, "I'm Marcus Bell. My father was Sergeant David Bell, 1971, Laos. Your Huey picked him up when his squad went down. He never forgot you. Not once. He said if I ever met you, I was to stand at attention and shake your hand." Elijah blinked. The world seemed to tilt. "David Bell," he said softly. "He was the one with the shattered leg. He made it?" "Because of you," Marcus replied, "because you flew into hell when no one else would." Without waiting, Marcus Bell snapped to attention in the middle of the cabin and saluted. The gesture was sharp, immaculate, as if he were still a cadet and Elijah the commanding officer. He held the salute. Passengers watched, many no longer hiding their shock or their shame. A boy near the front clutched his mother's arm. An older woman pressed her fingers to her lips. Slowly, Elijah reached out and returned the salute, not with fanfare, but with a gravity that made the air vibrate. When their hands met in a firm, solemn handshake, something shifted in the cabin. People exhaled, eyes welled. Even the engines seemed to hum lower. Captain Bell turned to the flight attendant. "Find the person who took this seat," he said, gesturing to business class. "Move them to mine. I'll fly from the jump seat if I have to, but Colonel Brooks flies where he was assigned." "Sir, she began, her voice faltering. "Now," he said again, not unkindly but without room for negotiation. It wasn't just an order. It was a reckoning. And it wasn't only for Elijah. It was for every veteran who had been forgotten, for every quiet sacrifice buried beneath bureaucracy. The woman who had taken Elijah's seat in business class stood up without a word. Her cheeks were flushed with embarrassment, but she didn't argue. She stepped aside. And Captain Bell, not an attendant, not a staff member, took Elijah gently by the shoulder and said, "Let me walk you back, sir." The applause didn't start immediately. It began as a murmur, A few claps, scattered, hesitant. But as Elijah walked back up the aisle, shoulder to shoulder with the pilot who owed him his family, the applause grew. It filled the cabin. It rose and spread like a wave. Not polite, not scripted. Real, reverent, raw. Elijah didn't smile, but his eyes shone. And as he sat back down in seat 3A, for the second time that morning, the world finally seemed to remember who he was. The moment Elijah lowered himself back into seat 3A, escorted not by protocol, but by legacy, the cabin shifted from whispers to reverence. The man who had walked humbly toward humiliation now sat with a kind of quiet gravity that needed no announcement. He didn't puff his chest or bask in attention. He simply nodded once to Captain Bell, who, after a firm handshake, turned on his heel and walked back toward the cockpit. But before disappearing behind the door, the captain paused, pivoted halfway, and gave one final salute. This time, it wasn't about duty. It was about debt. And every soul on board felt it. The cockpit door closed, the engines rumbled. But the cabin remained unusually still, as if nobody quite knew how to return to normal after witnessing a man be pulled back from the shadows of obscurity into the full light of recognition. Elijah folded his hands once more on his lap, his breathing steady, though his eyes lingered on the carpet just ahead of him, as if reading the invisible footprints of memory. A woman across the aisle, tears brimming, leaned toward him. "Thank you for your service, sir," she said gently. He looked up and nodded, offering the kind of soft smile that comes from a lifetime of hearing the words and never expecting them. "You deserve more than that seat," a man 2 rows back called out, his voice thick with emotion. "You deserve a damn statue." That drew a light chuckle from a few passengers, but Elijah simply shook his head. "I was just doing my job," he said, barely above a whisper. His voice wasn't dramatic. It didn't reach for sympathy, but its calmness held more power than any award ever could. Slowly, passengers began returning to their routines, but there was a visible shift. People sat straighter. Phones were lowered, screens dimmed, conversations became hushed. In the silence, respect had taken root. In the cockpit, Captain Marcus Bell sat in his chair, headset on, but his mind lingering on what had just unfolded behind him. He glanced to the side where a small framed photo was pinned near the dash, a black and white picture of his father in fatigues, smiling awkwardly beside another man. A man with sharp cheekbones, tired eyes, and a strength in his stance that said he'd seen things no metal could describe. Elijah Brooks, the man who had flown back into enemy fire to save a stranger's son. Marcus smiled faintly, tapped the photo once with 2 fingers like a private ritual, then turned his attention back to the skies. Back in seat 3A, Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, and in that stillness, memories came. Not in loud, painful flashes, but in soft, distant echoes. He remembered the day his co-pilot went down in the jungle. The boy was only 19. Elijah had flown low through a rainstorm that threatened to snap the rotors, and when they found the wreckage, it was burning. He remembered carrying the injured boy out as bullets cracked the air behind him. He remembered the face of a crying child in Haiti, reaching up as floodwaters crept closer. He remembered flying over war zones that didn't have names on maps yet, delivering food, medicine, hope. But no one remembered those flights when he landed at airports. No one offered him early boarding for flying into storms. No one at the ticket counter asked his name with reverence. Until today. The sudden clink of ice in a glass brought him back. A flight attendant approached, not the one from earlier. This one, younger, eyes kind, holding a glass of orange juice and a handwritten note. She knelt slightly so as not to tower over him and said softly, "Sir, the captain asked me to bring this to you." Elijah took the note and opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. "You didn't just save my father. You saved me. I hope this flight restores a fraction of what you've given. With respect, always. Marcus." Elijah stared at the words, reading them once, twice. His hands trembled again, but this time not from age. He folded the note carefully, like it was something sacred, and placed it in his shirt pocket near his heart. The young attendant stayed there for a moment longer before adding, "He asked if you'd be willing to come up front before we land. He said he'd be honored if you helped him bring us home." Elijah's head turned slowly. "He said that?" "Yes, sir," she smiled. "He said this flight should end the way it began, with you in command." Elijah chuckled, soft and low. "Well, I might be a bit rusty. He said he'd trust your hands with any sky." Elijah looked out the window again, the clouds vast and brilliant beyond the glass, and something within him loosened. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a forgotten relic tucked in the back of the world's memory. He felt seen, not just for what he'd done, but for who he still was. As the plane climbed higher into the blue, something profound had shifted in the hearts of everyone on board. This wasn't just another flight. It had become a journey back to dignity, to honor, to the truth that some people carry whole histories in their silence, and deserve to have those histories held up to the light. And somewhere, high above the earth, Elijah Brooks sat quietly in seat 3A, no longer just a passenger, but the soul of the sky. The clouds stretched like soft glaciers across the sky, undisturbed and radiant in the sunlight that poured through the aircraft's high windows. At 36,000 feet, everything on the ground seemed impossibly far away. Like war, like pain, like the times Elijah Brooks had fought for lives that were never mentioned in textbooks. He sat still in seat 3A, fingers gently tracing the edge of the note tucked inside his pocket. The folded paper warmed against his chest, the ink still fresh, yet the gratitude in it felt decades overdue. For a moment, he thought back to the young man who had handed him the controls of a battered Huey over a burning jungle because his own hands were shaking too much to steer. That young man hadn't survived the crash landing, but Elijah had. And now, 50 years later, someone had asked him to take the controls again. The intercom crackled softly. A woman's voice, calm, professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your flight attendant. The captain would like to recognize a very special passenger aboard today. Colonel Elijah Brooks, retired U.S. Air Force, humanitarian pilot, and recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross. We thank you, sir, for your lifetime of service to our country and to people around the world. Please join us in a round of applause." It began slowly, hesitantly. Then it grew. Not scattered, not polite, earnest. Dozens of hands clapping in sync, not just for what Elijah had done, but for the fact that someone had finally said it out loud. His eyes stayed on the window, but his jaw clenched slightly. It wasn't pride, it was release. He hadn't been acknowledged in a moment like this in decades, and certainly never on a commercial airline. The woman across the aisle, her mascara slightly smudged now, tapped the man beside her, handed him her phone and whispered, "Take a photo of him. Not for social media, just to remember this." Near the rear of the plane, the teenage boy from earlier sat with wide eyes, lips barely moving as he repeated the name Elijah Brooks, under his breath like a secret spell. The boy's mother turned to him. "Now you know what a hero looks like," she whispered. "It's not always who you expect." Then, the sound of light footsteps returning. The young attendant from before, her name tag read Tiana, approached once more. "Colonel Brooks," she said, her voice gentler this time. "Captain Bell says he's ready if you are." Elijah looked up slowly, eyes locking with hers. There was no pressure in her voice, no urgency, just something close to reverence. He nodded once, unfolded himself from the seat, and rose. She walked beside him, past passengers who now smiled or reached out quietly. One man simply said, "God bless you." Another extended a fist over the aisle, which Elijah gently tapped in return. The same aisle that had humiliated him less than an hour ago now felt different. This was not a walk of shame. It was a walk of honor. When he reached the front of the plane, the cockpit door opened again with a soft hiss. Captain Bell was already standing, motioning Elijah inside. "Welcome back to the flight deck, sir," he said, eyes gleaming. "We don't normally allow passengers up here, but I figured exceptions should be made for legends." Elijah stepped in, the scent of avionics and recycled air oddly familiar. The hum of the engines, the flicker of lights on the control panel. It brought him back in an instant. His fingers twitched instinctively, remembering positions and levers long retired from his hands. "It's changed a bit," he muttered. "You'd be surprised how much is still the same," Bell replied. "I thought you might like to help me bring her down. I'll stay on comms. You just feel it again." Elijah slid into the jump seat, his knees cracking slightly as he did. He looked out through the expansive windows at the horizon, the blue stretching infinitely, the clouds parting like curtains. "You know," Elijah said after a beat, "when I retired, I told myself I wouldn't miss the flying. Just the people. But I lied. I missed the sky every damn day." Bell smiled but didn't speak. He knew better than to interrupt a man who had earned his silence. Elijah's eyes moved across the controls, then back to the view. Tell me something, son. Why did you really come out that cockpit? Bell took a breath, staring ahead. Because all my life, I've heard about the man who saved my father. A man who pulled him out of fire and carried him back to life. And when I saw them make you walk to the back like you were nothing, I saw my father being erased. I saw my history being ignored. And I couldn't let that happen. Not on my plane. Elijah nodded slowly, his hand gripping the edge of the console. Then let's bring this bird home right. And in the last 20 minutes of the flight, with thousands of feet below and the sun beginning to kiss the edge of the world, a man who had once been told to move to the back of the plane sat up front again. Not just beside the captain, but inside history. Redemption doesn't always roar. Sometimes it lands softly, like wheels on a runway, with dignity intact and hearts forever changed. As the plane began its descent into Washington, D.C., the skyline below shimmered in the haze of late afternoon. The Potomac curled like a ribbon of light, and in the distance, the Capitol stood still and small, like a monument watching quietly over the landing of something far more personal. Inside the cockpit, Elijah Brooks sat in calm silence, watching the horizon flatten. He hadn't touched the controls, nor had he needed to. Captain Bell had flown the plane, hands steady, voice crisp in the headset, as he communicated with tower control. But the presence of Elijah beside him, just his stillness, his awareness, his history, was like flying with a living compass. "Approach vector holding," Bell said, glancing over. "Winds light at 5 knots. Runway 19 in sight." Elijah nodded, his eyes locked forward. "You ever land in a dust storm with one engine on fire?" Bell raised an eyebrow, grinning. "Not yet." "Then don't," Elijah said flatly, and they both laughed. But the humor didn't last long, because as the ground drew nearer, Elijah's chest tightened, not with fear, but with something he hadn't felt in decades, arrival. Not just at a city, at a reckoning. At a moment where his story, so often hidden beneath quiet service and darker skin, was finally breaking through the clouds. The wheels touched down with a soft bounce, clean, controlled, like a whisper of skill, and the cabin erupted in applause again. This time not for a name they heard on a speaker, but for a soul they had seen in action. The seatbelt signs chimed, but no one moved. Passengers remained seated, not from duty, but from understanding. A message had spread down the aisle like current through wire. Let the colonel disembark first. The cockpit door opened. Captain Bell stepped out first. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced over the PA, "thank you for flying with us. Before we deboard, I ask that you allow one man to exit first. He's waited long enough for that kind of respect." Then he turned and held out his hand. Elijah stood, legs aching but firm, back still as straight as it had been at 23. As he stepped back into the main cabin, row after row watched him pass. Not as an old man, not as a passenger who'd been reassigned, but as a symbol of something they hadn't known they needed to witness. "Thank you, sir," one said. "You're the reason my grandfather made it home." "God bless you. I'm sorry for what happened earlier. You're not forgotten." The words came one by one, but they stacked upon each other like bricks building a monument. Not in stone, but in hearts. At the plane's doorway, another flight attendant, tears lining her eyes, handed him back his original boarding pass. "Seat 3A, she whispered. "It's yours. Always was." He took it without speaking, nodded gently, and stepped onto the jet bridge. But the moment he appeared at the terminal entrance, something extraordinary happened. A group of passengers who had disembarked ahead of him, those in wheelchairs, young children, uniformed soldiers on standby, had formed a spontaneous half circle just outside the gate. And in the center of them stood a man in a Navy suit, holding a single white rose. "Colonel Elijah Brooks?" the man asked. "I work for the Department of Veterans Affairs. We heard what happened mid-flight. I've been authorized to greet you personally and offer—" "No need," Elijah interrupted, his voice still warm but unwavering. "The greeting already happened. Back there, when people remembered who I was." The VA man paused, then nodded. "Understood, sir." Elijah took the rose gently, turning it in his fingers like a memory. Cameras clicked somewhere, but he didn't look toward them. His eyes scanned the crowd until they found the boy, the same teen who'd whispered to his mom hours earlier. The kid stood nervously off to the side, hands shoved deep in his hoodie. Elijah walked to him, placed the rose in his hands, and said, "You carry this for me, all right? One day someone's going to ask you what happened on this flight, and you're going to tell them." "Tell them what?" the boy asked, Elijah smiled. That the sky never forgets the hands that once held it steady. Then he turned and without ceremony walked toward the exit, not as someone dismissed, but as someone reclaimed, and the automatic doors opened not for a passenger, but for a hero returning home. The fluorescent lights of the airport corridor hummed quietly as Elijah Brooks walked alone, his steps steady despite the wear of time on his bones. He passed posters for rental cars and coffee chains, advertisements of smiling families headed toward vacations, but none of them saw him, just like they hadn't for years. But today, everything felt different. His fingers still cradled the warmth of the white rose he'd handed to the boy. His ears still rang with the applause, not for celebrity or politics, but for something deeper, remembrance. He'd walked through dozens of airports in his life, after missions, after ceremonies, after the war. But this time, he wasn't invisible, and that meant something. He made his way toward the terminal's Veterans Lounge, a quiet room hidden near Gate 14, marked by a small bronze plaque that most people passed without noticing. He tapped gently on the frosted glass door before pushing it open. Inside, the air was still and respectful. Leather armchairs faced a muted TV playing an old black and white war film. A man in a wheelchair looked up from his paperback. A woman with silver braids sipping tea raised her eyebrows. Elijah nodded to them both. "Morning," he said softly. "Afternoon now," the woman corrected, smiling. "But that's all right." Elijah chuckled. He took a seat near the window and stared out at the tarmac. A baggage truck rolled past. A plane lifted slowly into the sky, its nose splitting through the clouds like a memory taking flight. The man in the wheelchair turned his chair slightly. "You were the one from Flight 209, weren't you? The one the pilot saluted?" Elijah didn't respond right away. He kept his eyes on the runway. Then, slowly, "I was supposed to be moved to economy." The other man snorted. "Yeah, that happens. People forget. Systems forget. But the sky doesn't." Elijah turned, curious. "You flew?" The man tapped his chest. "Charlie Company, 1st of the 9th. Recon Bird Dog. Vietnam. Crashed twice. Walked out once. Crawled the second." Elijah nodded. "You remember the sound?" "Of the rotors? Always." They both sat there for a while, not talking, but not in silence either, just sharing the weight of years in a room made for those who once lifted others. Then a voice broke through the quiet. A voice young, uncertain. "Excuse me? Are you Colonel Brooks?" Elijah turned. It was the teenage boy from the plane, still in his hoodie, clutching the rose awkwardly, his eyes wide with the kind of awe you only see in someone who's just witnessed history. "You followed me?" Elijah asked, surprised but not displeased. The boy shrugged, sheepish. "I didn't want to go home yet. I wanted to ask you something." The woman with silver braids raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The man in the wheelchair leaned in, interested. "Go ahead," Elijah said gently. The boy sat beside him, fidgeting. "They gave a speech at school last week about courage. They talked about people who changed laws, led marches, spoke on stages." Elijah waited. "But no one mentioned you, or people like you. The ones who just show up, quiet, do what needs to be done, save lives, then disappear." Elijah looked at the boy for a long time. "That's because we weren't doing it to be remembered. We were doing it because it needed doing." "But doesn't it bother you," the boy asked, "to be forgotten?" Elijah's eyes returned to the tarmac. "Only if I start believing my value depends on being seen." The boy sat with that for a moment, then held up the rose. "I kept it safe," he said. "My hands were sweating, but I didn't drop it." Elijah smiled. "That rose is heavier than it looks. It carries names." "Whose?" "The ones who didn't make it back. The ones who didn't get a seat on the plane today. You carry it for them now." The boy looked down at the flower, as if it had changed shape. In a way, it had. "Can I ask you one more thing?" he said. "Of course. What does being brave feel like?" Elijah didn't answer right away. His gaze was far away again, somewhere between the clouds and the gunfire of a forgotten jungle. Finally, that he said, "It feels like fear you walk through anyway. Like pain you carry without bitterness, like stepping back into a burning sky, not because you want to, but because someone's still out there, waiting to be brought home." The room was silent again, but this time, it was sacred. The boy stood slowly, as if understanding he'd been given something far more than just a story. "Thank you, sir," he said, voice cracking. "No," Elijah corrected softly, rising to his feet. "Thank you." for asking." They shook hands, the boy's small palm swallowed in Elijah's worn grip. And then the teen turned and left the room, walking differently now, like he had something to protect, something to carry forward. Elijah sat back down, his joints aching, but his soul lighter than it had been in years. The woman with silver braids raised her teacup toward him. "About time someone asked the right question," she said. Elijah gave her a knowing nod. "And about time someone answered it." Outside, another jet thundered skyward. But inside that quiet room near Gate 14, a different kind of flight had already taken place. Not through clouds, but through memory, recognition, and the long overdue landing of a man who never asked to be saluted, but finally was. By the time Elijah Brooks exited the Veterans Lounge 2 hours later, something unusual was stirring just outside the terminal walls. He didn't know it yet, but the silence that had long surrounded his name was beginning to crack, like ice under the weight of truth. As he stepped into the sunlight and waited for the airport shuttle, the wind brushed gently against his face, warm and forgiving. He inhaled slowly, the way one does when returning to a place they'd once been erased from. But this time, something had shifted. And far away, in places he hadn't walked in years, his story had begun to travel without him. It started with a single tweet, just a grainy phone video posted by a young passenger in row 14. It showed Elijah being asked to move to economy. Then, the captain walking out, the salute, the handshake, the applause, nothing edited, no music, just raw footage of a quiet injustice. And the louder justice that followed. Beneath the video, only 6 words. "This man deserves more than silence." Within minutes, it had been shared, then shared again. Veterans groups picked it up. Black history forums reposted it. A retired general commented, "Colonel Brooks flew humanitarian missions in Laos, Cambodia, and Sierra Leone. We've failed him too long." A former child refugee wrote, "That man dropped aid to our village when I was 5. I remember his eyes. I never forgot." And suddenly, Elijah's name, buried under decades of modesty, rose like a banner in digital skies. He didn't own a smartphone. He didn't know what going viral meant. But in coffee shops, classrooms, airports across America, people watched the video and sat back in stunned silence. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. Because it exposed something everyone knew but rarely faced. The way quiet black excellence is too often dismissed until someone else vouches for its worth. Back at home in a modest 2-bedroom house on the edge of a quiet Virginia town, Elijah's porch light flickered gently in the dusk. His neighbor, Miss Arlene, a retired schoolteacher in her 70s, peered out through her blinds. She gasped when she saw the video on her niece's phone. "That's Elijah," she whispered, her hand trembling as she reached for the screen. "That's our Elijah." She had lived next to him for 18 years and never knew about his medals. He mowed his own lawn, walked to church alone, fixed the neighbor kids' bikes without ever asking for thanks. And yet, there he was, standing tall on that plain like the last leaf of a forgotten chapter. The story reached a local newsroom by evening. Then NPR called, then CNN. By the next morning, major outlets were requesting interviews, but Elijah declined them all. "I didn't do anything special," he told the first producer, who reached his landline. "I just didn't leave anyone behind." But someone did want to talk to him. That same teenage boy from the plane, now sitting at his kitchen table, still clutching the rose. His name was Isaiah. And on his phone screen was a new article, "The Man Who Quietly Carried Us All, Colonel Elijah Brooks." Isaiah's teacher had seen the video. Then his whole class watched it. And now he'd been asked to write a paper, not just about what happened on the flight, but about what it meant. Isaiah stared at the blinking cursor for 20 minutes before typing. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes it's an old man who doesn't argue when you humiliate him. Sometimes it's a pilot who salutes before he speaks. Sometimes it's a rose passed into the hands of a kid who didn't know history could walk right past him in an aisle seat. Back in Virginia, Elijah's phone rang again. He almost didn't answer. But this time, the voice on the other end wasn't a reporter. It was someone he hadn't spoken to in over 40 years. "Colonel Brooks," the voice said, cracking with age. "It's Raymond Carter. We flew together over Mogadishu. You pulled me out when my leg was pinned." Elijah closed his eyes, remembering. "Raymond, I thought you'd passed." "Almost did. Twice," the man laughed weakly. "But I saw your video. I had to call. I never said thank you." Elijah leaned back in his kitchen chair, the past settling over him like an old jacket. You just did. That night, outside his window, Elijah saw two neighborhood boys riding their bikes under the street lamp. One of them was wearing a makeshift pilot's cap made from a winter beanie. The other was holding a notebook with a drawing of a helicopter. They waved when they saw him. "Mr. Brooks!" they shouted. "You're famous now!" Elijah chuckled, then stepped onto the porch. "Fame's like fog," he said. "It rolls in and it rolls out. But character, that's what leaves footprints." The next day, something even more unexpected arrived. A formal letter, gold embossed, delivered by hand. Inside, it read, "You are cordially invited to speak at the National Air and Space Museum this Veterans Day. We believe your story deserves not just to be told, but to be remembered. With gratitude, the Smithsonian Institute." Elijah stared at the invitation for a long time. Then he carefully folded it, set it beside the rose that Isaiah had returned to him, and whispered to no one in particular, "It's not about being remembered, it's about what we choose to remember." And across the country, people were starting to choose him. Elijah Brooks stood backstage at the National Air and Space Museum, just behind a curtain lined with red, white, and blue. The echo of muffled voices from the packed auditorium hummed like distant propellers, each word a reminder that today, he wasn't invisible. For once in his life, the world had turned to face him. And yet, he wasn't sure he belonged here. A volunteer adjusted his lapel microphone, her hands shaking slightly. "Are you nervous, sir?" she asked. Elijah gave a small smile. "Not really. I've flown into typhoons and mortar fire. This is just people sitting in chairs." She laughed, then paused. "They're all here for you, Colonel." He didn't answer. He just nodded once and turned his gaze toward the stage lights bleeding through the curtain. Beyond them sat more than 600 guests. Military brass, historians, journalists, families, students, even a few of the passengers from that fateful flight. Front row center sat Captain Marcus Bell in full uniform, his posture rigid, but his eyes warm with pride. Beside him was Isaiah, the boy from the plane, holding a notebook on his lap with pages folded like battle plans. The announcer's voice boomed gently through the auditorium. "And now, we welcome a man whose courage never sought spotlight, whose service spanned continents and decades, and whose dignity taught us all something about silence, memory, and justice. Colonel Elijah Brooks." Thunderous applause rose as Elijah stepped onto the stage. But he didn't walk like a celebrity. He walked like a man who'd taken long journeys with heavy boots. He didn't wave. He didn't smile for the cameras. He simply approached the podium, paused, and looked at the crowd. Then the applause faded, and the silence began. Not an awkward silence, a reverent one. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat gently, and began. "I was told I should write something formal," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "That I should prepare a speech, maybe list the places I served, the lives I helped save, the medals I was given. But I figured, if you already know all that, I shouldn't have to say it. And if you didn't know it before, then the point isn't really about me. It's about all the people like me, people whose names never make it into textbooks, who don't get saluted when they land, people who sit in aisle seats, not because they're forgotten, but because they've learned to carry weight quietly." No one moved. Elijah glanced down briefly, then continued. "Some of you may have watched a video, a moment on a plane, a mistake made, and then corrected. What you saw was not extraordinary. What was extraordinary was that someone noticed. What was extraordinary was a boy who asked, 'Why?' and a man who stood up and said, 'No more.'" He scanned the audience slowly, his gaze settling briefly on Captain Bell. "You see, I didn't ask to be recognized. Most of us didn't. We flew into storms, into fire, not for medals, but because we believed in something bigger than comfort or applause. We believed in duty. We believed in each other. And sometimes, we believed in a future that couldn't see us yet." Isaiah leaned forward in his chair, gripping his notebook. Elijah took a breath. "I was moved to economy that day not because of my skin, not because of my age, and not because of policy, though all those things played a part. I was moved because too many systems are designed to forget the quiet ones, the ones who don't demand attention, the ones who assume dignity will be enough." He paused again. No one coughed, no phones buzzed, only stillness. "But then something remarkable happened," Elijah said. "The plane didn't just turn around, the people did. You turned around, you saw me, and more importantly, you saw yourselves in me. Because deep down, we all want to know that what we gave, what we carried, what we endured, mattered. He stepped slightly to the side of the podium now, his body relaxed, his presence firm. I stand here not because I flew into combat zones or delivered aid to children. I stand here because someone, finally, said, "This man matters." And if my story reminds you of someone else you forgot to thank, someone you forgot to ask about, then maybe today was worth it. Elijah nodded toward Isaiah. A young man on that flight carried a rose for me. He asked what bravery felt like. I told him it felt like walking through fear anyway, like showing up when no one's watching, like being told to move to the back of the plane and walking forward instead. A soft gasp rippled through the room. He smiled, just slightly. Now, I'm not interested in statues. I don't need parades. But I do believe in memory, not just for me, for all of us. So I ask you, when you leave this place and someone tells you a story that doesn't come with fireworks or headlines, listen anyway. Because heroes don't always walk into rooms with drums behind them. Sometimes they sit quietly at 3A. The audience rose to their feet. Applause thundered, not for performance, but for truth. Elijah stepped back, nodded once to the crowd, then turned to walk off the stage. But before he disappeared behind the curtain, he stopped, looked once more toward Isaiah, and gave a slow, deliberate salute. The boy rose instantly and without hesitation returned it. The room erupted again. Not just in applause this time, but in something deeper, in collective understanding. And as the curtain fell, the cameras kept rolling, but Elijah had already turned his back to them. Because for him, the real honor was not in being seen. It was in being remembered, exactly as he was. 3 days after the speech, Elijah Brooks sat on his front porch with a cup of black coffee balanced in his hand, watching the sunrise crawl across the quiet Virginia street like it had done every morning for decades. The air was still, broken only by the distant sound of a neighbor's lawn sprinkler sputtering to life and a few birds daring the dawn with fragile songs. The events of the last few days had stirred something in him, not just attention, but memory, thick and unresolved. He had received letters from people he didn't remember saving, calls from generals he thought had forgotten his name, and even a voicemail from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, thanking him for reminding the country what honor looks like. Still, he felt a strange ache, not the one in his knees or his back, but something in his chest, a heaviness that came not from years of silence, but from the sudden weight of being heard. Then came the knock. 3 short raps. He opened the door to a young man in a dark suit, holding a slim black envelope with gold trim. "Colonel Brooks?" the man asked. Elijah nodded. "This is for you," he said, handing over the envelope like it contained something sacred, from the White House. Elijah raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He closed the door, sat back in his old recliner, and slowly peeled open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper, and in the center, in calligraphic print, it read, "The President of the United States requests the honor of your presence at the National Medal of Freedom Awards ceremony, to be held at the White House Rose Garden. You are to receive, in recognition of lifetime service and humanitarian aviation, the Presidential Medal of Freedom." Elijah stared at the letter, then read it again and again. He had once crash-landed a helicopter in a monsoon, holding pressure on a fellow soldier's bleeding abdomen while flying one-handed through smoke and lightning. He had once dropped food and medicine into a cholera-ridden refugee camp after 3 pilots before him had turned back. But this piece of paper felt impossible. He placed it on the coffee table and just stared at it until the sun climbed past the trees and painted it gold. Word spread quickly. News anchors covered it. Old war buddies called him with tears in their voices. And across the country, people who had never heard his name were now saying it aloud like a promise they intended to keep. On the morning of the ceremony, Elijah stood in front of his bedroom mirror, wearing the only new suit he'd bought in 15 years. The fabric was stiff, and the tie knotted awkwardly, but he stood tall. Outside, a black car waited at the curb. When he stepped out, kids from the neighborhood lined the sidewalk with cardboard signs. One read, "Seat 3A forever." Another said, "Real heroes don't need capes." He gave a wave, subtle, almost bashful, then slipped into the car. At the White House gates, he was greeted not by security, but by a Marine in full-dress uniform who saluted crisply and said, "We've been waiting for you, sir." The rose garden shimmered in late spring sunlight. Rows of chairs faced a podium adorned with the presidential seal. Journalists packed the edges, pens and lenses trained toward the stage, but Elijah barely noticed them. He was too busy searching the crowd until his eyes found Isaiah, seated proudly beside Captain Bell, both of them smiling, as if they too couldn't believe any of this was real. When his name was called, the applause was long and thunderous, but he didn't rush. He walked slowly, deliberately, every step a reminder that he had carried the weight of this moment for decades. The president, a tall man with gray at his temples and sincerity in his voice, placed the medal around Elijah's neck and whispered, "We should have done this years ago." Elijah didn't reply. He simply nodded, eyes glassy but clear. Cameras flashed, hands clapped, and yet, in the noise, Elijah's mind returned to the quiet hum of rotors, the smell of dust and smoke, the echo of radios crackling with coordinates and urgency. He thought of the faces that never made it back. He thought of the missions no one wrote about. He thought of the days he returned home and no one looked up. After the ceremony, he was led inside for a private reception. Dignitaries shook his hand. Historians asked for quotes. One young reporter said, "Colonel, now that the world knows who you are, what's next?" Elijah looked at her, then out the window at the flag fluttering gently in the breeze. "Next," he repeated, "I'll go home, back to my porch. Maybe fix the gate that keeps swinging. Maybe teach a few kids how to ride their bikes straight." She laughed nervously. "Really?" He smiled. "What else is there? I didn't fly to become famous. I flew so people could live. I'll keep doing that, just with quieter wings." Later that night, as the sky turned violet over D.C., Elijah returned to his hotel room, medal still around his neck. He sat by the window, looking out over the city where history had finally made room for him. And though he would never admit it aloud, he allowed himself a single tear. Not for himself, but for every brother and sister who'd flown, fought, served, and faded away without ever hearing their names called. That night, the world slept peacefully beneath stars they would never touch. But one of them had finally come home. The morning air over Langley Air Force Base was thick with fog, curling low over the runway like breath that refused to leave the earth. The sound of seagulls cut faintly through the mist, and the distant whine of a jet engine pierced the silence like a needle through cloth. Elijah Brooks stood just outside the base's security checkpoint, a visitor badge clipped to his lapel, the Medal of Freedom tucked safely inside the inner pocket of his jacket. He hadn't stepped foot on this base in more than 30 years, not since the last humanitarian flight he'd ever flown out of here, an emergency mission to Honduras, after a hurricane leveled half a province. That was before they grounded him, before they boxed up his flight logs and handed him a folded flag and a letter that said, "Thank you," in the kind of font that meant they'd already forgotten his name. But today, something called him back, a letter, handwritten on official letterhead from the base commander himself. "Colonel Brooks, it would be an honor if you visited Hangar 9 this Saturday at 0800. We have something for you." No explanations, just coordinates. Just that tone, the kind that suggested somebody had finally dusted off the archives and realized a piece of their foundation was missing. He walked slowly across the tarmac, accompanied by a young lieutenant who tried to keep up without asking too many questions. As they approached the massive gray structure of Hangar 9, Elijah's boots echoed with each step, the sound as familiar as his own heartbeat. He'd once run across this very concrete, helmet under arm, wind whipping his fatigues. Now, he walked slower, but with a kind of dignity no youth could ever fake. The hangar doors were open. Inside, a crowd had gathered. Not a large one, but a meaningful one. Men and women in uniform, old and young, a few former pilots in bomber jackets, leaning on canes. Technicians who stood at attention, and at the center, draped in a ceremonial flag, was an aircraft, an old Bell UH-1 Huey helicopter. Its paint faded, but its body still sturdy. Elijah stopped. His breath caught, and for a moment time folded inward, because he recognized it. The tail number, the dent along the starboard side, the patch skid where shrapnel had once torn through. "That's Bird 6, he whispered. "We called her Faith." The base commander stepped forward, a tall black woman with steel in her eyes and grace in her stance. "We pulled her out of storage last year. Been sitting in a scrap lot in Arizona. When your story went public, one of our historians found your name logged in over 72 missions under that tail number. She carried your legacy. We couldn't let her rust away." Elijah walked toward the Huey like one approaches a gravestone or an old friend. He laid a hand gently on her side, closed his eyes, and nodded. She never let me down, not once. The commander cleared her throat. Sir, if it's all right, we'd like to dedicate her today, as a static display, fully restored, permanently stationed right here at Langley, with your name on the plaque. Elijah blinked. My name? She smiled. It's already etched. A small ceremony began. Nothing flashy, just a few words from the commander, a reading of his service record, a slow unfolding of the flag that had draped the Huey. The national anthem played softly from a speaker. Then, the plaque was revealed. Brushed metal. Clean lettering. It read, Colonel Elijah Brooks, U.S. Air Force, ready. Pilot, humanitarian, brother in arms. He flew for those who couldn't run. He carried more than missions. He carried hope. Elijah stood silent for a long time, the words settling into him like rain into dry soil. People approached him after, one by one. Some shook his hand. Some hugged him. One young cadet simply saluted and said, Sir, I joined the Air Force because of you. Elijah chuckled softly. You couldn't have known about me. The cadet replied, I do now. As the crowd thinned, the base commander walked beside him toward the hangar doors. You know, she said, my grandfather served under you. He always said you were the best pilot nobody talked about. Elijah raised an eyebrow. What was his name? Arthur Wallace. Elijah froze. A flood of memory returned. Red clay, a broken radio, a midnight extraction. Your grandfather was the radio tech who refused to leave his post under fire. I carried him out when the base collapsed. Yes, sir, she said. He told me if I ever met you, I should look you in the eye and say, we never forgot. We just didn't say it loud enough. Elijah looked away for a moment, swallowing emotion that came faster now in his old age. Well, he said quietly, you've said it plenty today. Before he left the hangar, he turned one last time and gave a gentle two-fingered salute to the Huey, now motionless but shining in the light like a relic returned to its rightful altar. As he stepped back into the sunlight, the fog had lifted. The runway ahead was clear. And though he no longer flew, Elijah Brooks finally felt something he hadn't in decades. Like the sky itself had waited for this moment to say, welcome home. The chamber was colder than Elijah expected. Not in temperature, but in tone. Marble columns, high ceilings, long rows of polished oak chairs arranged like judgment itself. The U.S. Capitol hearing room had no interest in sentiment. It was a room built for debate, for defense, for decisions that often forgot the people they affected. But today, Elijah Brooks had been asked to speak. Not for fame, not for decoration, but because the country at last was listening. He stood at the threshold, hands folded neatly in front of him, wearing the same dark suit he'd worn to the White House, a small American flag pinned to his lapel, and the Medal of Freedom left at home. Let the words matter more than the medal, he'd said to himself that morning. He was ushered forward to a single chair at the front of the room, a nameplate already there. Colonel Elijah Brooks. Ret. He looked at it for a moment before sitting and thought, funny how a nameplate only appears when the cameras do. Behind him sat an audience of military brass, congressional aides, journalists, and scattered veterans in old uniforms. Across from him, members of Congress, some polite, some distant, a few genuinely attentive. The committee chair, an older white senator from Georgia, adjusted his microphone and cleared his throat. Colonel Brooks, he said, we've read your story, seen the video, and in light of public interest, we wanted to invite you here today to speak on your experiences, specifically about how veterans of color have historically been underserved or overlooked in this country. We're conducting a review of systemic disparities. You've lived through it. We thought you might help us understand it. Elijah nodded once. Yes, sir, he replied evenly. I can speak to that. You may begin with your statement, the chair said, and the room fell silent. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his voice low but deliberate. My name is Elijah Brooks. I flew humanitarian and combat missions for the United States Air Force from 1968 to 1989. I logged more than 4,000 hours in the air, carried food into war zones, evacuated orphans from floodplains, extracted soldiers from burning jungles. I've landed in 7 countries under gunfire. I've been shot at, rained on, and left behind. And until a flight attendant moved me to economy class a few weeks ago, nobody in this government had ever asked me to sit in a seat like this. There was a ripple in the room. No one interrupted. Elijah continued. The question isn't why I was moved back on that plane. The question is, why was I never moved forward in the first place? He looked directly at the senators now, his gaze steady. For decades, veterans like me, Black veterans, Latino veterans, Native veterans, have returned home not to parades, but to suspicion. We served the same country, wore the same uniform, saluted the same flag, but we were never welcomed the same way. We were forgotten in the records, overlooked in the honors, and erased from the history books. You invite us to serve, but rarely invite us to speak. Until now. A senator from Illinois, visibly moved, leaned in. Colonel Brooks, are you suggesting that the disparity lies in recognition alone or in systemic policy? Elijah smiled faintly. I'm suggesting that your policies are written in marble, but our stories are written in ash. And unless you actively seek to preserve them, they're gone the moment the wind changes. Murmurs swept the gallery. The chair cleared his throat again. Colonel, what would you have us do? Specifically? Elijah took a breath. You want specifics? Start by funding mental health programs in neighborhoods where veterans of color live. Create archives that don't erase our contributions. Include our faces in your textbooks, not just as footnotes, but as chapters. And for God's sake, stop measuring patriotism by who salutes loudest at the stadium. Some of us saluted in silence for 50 years and never missed a beat. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then he added, and the next time you draft a list of names for recognition, don't wait for the internet to embarrass you into remembering us. One of the younger senators leaned forward. Do you think your moment, on that plane, with that pilot, would have ever happened without social media? Elijah shook his head. No, but that's the point. Justice shouldn't depend on whether someone hits record. It should already be in the seat assignment. Laughter, brief and restrained, bubbled from a few corners of the room. Even the chairman cracked a reluctant smile. Elijah sat back, his statement complete, his presence somehow louder than the microphone. There were a few follow-up questions. Someone asked him about the role of mentorship in the military. Another asked if he believed representation was improving. He answered respectfully, firmly, never veering toward theatrics. When the hearing concluded, the chair stood and extended a hand. Colonel Brooks, on behalf of this committee and this country, we thank you. Elijah rose slowly, took the hand. But before letting go, he said quietly, then prove it. Not to me, to the kids still waiting to be seen. The senator nodded solemnly, understanding more in that moment than in any memo ever placed on his desk. As Elijah walked out of the chamber, past the marble columns, past the rotunda where history loomed in oil and stone, a few people rose to applaud. But he didn't look back. He didn't need a standing ovation. He needed something to stand for. And as he stepped back into the sunlight, a reporter called out, Colonel Brooks, will you be attending next year's Veterans Affairs Reform Summit? Elijah stopped just long enough to answer, depends. Will I need a boarding pass? Or will someone finally leave my seat open? Then he smiled, just barely, and disappeared into the city he had served his whole life, now echoing, finally, with the sound of his footsteps. 3 months passed. Summer gave way to a slow-burning fall, the kind that painted Elijah Brooks's small Virginia town in quiet hues of amber and bronze. The tree outside his porch dropped its first golden leaf with the softness of a sigh, and Elijah sat in his usual chair, sipping his morning coffee, reading the paper the old way, folded wide across his lap, ink smudging his fingertips. But this morning's paper carried something different, something rare. Veterans Affairs Committee unanimously passes Brooks' amendment, new equity mandate for underrepresented veterans. He read the headline twice, then once more for good measure. Below it, a photo. A younger congressional aide shaking his hand after the vote. The article outlined the legislation's contents: expanded mental health outreach in urban communities, a nationwide audit of military honors and neglected service records from minority veterans, and the creation of a digital archive called the Silent Service Project, dedicated to telling stories like his. At the bottom of the article, a single quote from Senator Martinez: "This isn't about fixing the past. It's about refusing to keep breaking the future." Elijah folded the paper gently and set it aside, staring out into the morning like it had just spoken his name. Across the street, two boys on bicycles wobbled toward the corner, one of them wearing a jacket several sizes too big, with Brooks Flight Academy stitched across the back in uneven thread. The kid had made it himself. Elijah chuckled and shook his head. "That boy's gonna break both arms trying to fly," he muttered and stood up. That afternoon, he returned to the community center, the same one where he'd once given a talk to 7 kids and a sleeping janitor. But today, the room was full. Not just with children, but parents, veterans, teachers. A small sign hung on the wall. Brooks Aviation Youth Initiative, lift as you climb. He walked to the front, slower than he used to, but still with the kind of posture that made kids sit up a little straighter when he passed. He didn't use notes. He never had. "You don't need to be a pilot to lift people," he began. "You just need to know what it feels like to carry something that matters." He talked about storms. Not the ones in the sky, but the ones inside. About what it meant to return from service and feel invisible. About how honor is not in the uniform, but in how you treat people after you take it off. And when he finished, the room was silent for a long time. Then came applause. Not explosive, but warm, consistent. The kind that said, "We hear you now. Please don't stop." As the room emptied, a girl no older than 10 approached him, clutching a notebook. "Mr. Brooks," she said shyly, "do you think someone like me could fly one day?" Elijah looked at her, black, bright-eyed, unsure but hungry. He knelt slowly, ignoring the crack in his knee. "What's your name?" "Ariel." "Well, Ariel," he said, "not only do I think you can fly, I think someone like you is the reason people like me did." Her smile broke something open in the room. That night, a letter arrived, hand-delivered again, but this time by a courier in civilian clothes. Inside was a simple invitation. "The Smithsonian Institution cordially invites Colonel Elijah Brooks, Ret., to attend the grand opening of the National Gallery of Undocumented Valor. The first wing of this permanent exhibit will be named in your honor." Elijah stared at it, mouth slightly open, until a knock at the door pulled him back. It was Isaiah. Taller now. He'd started coming by every Saturday to mow Elijah's lawn and pretend not to ask questions. "You see the news?" the boy asked. "I did. That gallery, that's you, man. You're in a museum now." Elijah laughed. "I used to sleep in hangars. Now I'm hanging on their walls. Life's got a sense of humor." "You gonna go?" Isaiah asked. Elijah leaned back in his chair. "I think I have to, not for the picture, for the promise." The gallery opened 2 weeks later. Inside its first wing, beside photos and declassified records and a flight helmet tagged Brooks, E, was a glass case with a single white rose, dried, delicate, preserved. The plaque beneath it read, "Given by a boy who watched history unfold on a plane and carried it forward." A recording played softly in the background. Elijah's voice from his congressional testimony filled the space. Justice shouldn't depend on whether someone hits record. It should already be in the seat assignment. Visitors came from every state. Veterans stood still for long minutes, heads bowed. Teachers brought students. Parents whispered to children. "This is what service looks like," one mother said. "Quiet, strong, and never asking for more than truth." As Elijah stood in the corner, quietly watching it all, someone approached him. A young Air Force cadet, barely 20. "Sir," he said, saluting crisply, "your story made me apply. My parents didn't believe someone like me could belong in that uniform, but I saw you, so I knew I could." Elijah nodded. "Then wear it well. You're not filling my shoes, you're making your own." That evening, after the gallery closed, Elijah remained in the exhibit long after the guests had gone. Alone now, he approached the rows, reached into his pocket, and pulled out the original boarding pass from Flight 209, crumpled, yellowed at the edges, the ink barely legible. He placed it beside the rose in the case, unannounced. No label, no frame. Just a silent artifact of a moment that changed everything. He whispered, "Seat 3A, took me 50 years to earn it, but it was worth every mile." Then he turned off the lights, closed the glass door behind him, and stepped out into the night. His legacy no longer in the clouds, but grounded, real, and forever in motion. Years later, when Elijah Brooks passed quietly in his sleep at the age of 94, no headlines broke, no speeches echoed across marble halls, but the sky knew, and so did those who had once sat near him, watched him, learned from him. At Langley Air Force Base, flags lowered to half-mast, not because a commander had ordered it, but because an airman had come home for the final time. In Washington, a young curator at the Smithsonian carefully placed a small velvet ribbon beside the dried rose and crumpled boarding pass, with a single handwritten card: Seat 3A will always belong to him. On Flight 209, years after that day, a flight attendant paused during boarding. The plane was different, the crew younger, the passengers new. But in business class, at Seat 3A, she gently placed a white rose on the headrest and whispered, "Reserved." Most travelers walked past without notice, but one elderly veteran, seeing it, paused, straightened his back, and saluted. And somewhere, above the clouds where medals don't matter and memory flies free, Elijah Brooks smiled, because his story had never been about being remembered, only about making sure others would never again be forgotten. He never asked for applause, never needed statues. But in the end, the world turned back to face him, not with grand gestures, but with quiet respect. Elijah Brooks taught us that real heroes don't sit in the spotlight. They sit in silence, in Seat 3A, carrying decades of service no one ever asked about. Until one day, someone finally did. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Drop a comment and tell us, who's the silent hero in your life? Share this video so others remember the ones we too often forget. And if you believe stories like these matter, like, subscribe, and help us keep them alive. Because at Blacklens Stories, we don't just tell stories, we restore legacies.